So you know I'm really serious when I put my hair back. So my hair's back and I'm really serious as I can be, I guess. Last week we discussed how myth permeates our culture via language and ideology. And I think it tied in very strongly with a previous board where we talked about allusions to myth in modern culture. And week 8, which this is a bit in the same vein because we're going to talk about fairy tales and how they are related to myth. And it looks like, as I'm speaking, like my words aren't hooking up with my mouth, so if there's a lag, I have no clue why. But moving on. Now, fantastic tales. They have existed since the human imagination has existed. And even in literature, we have a term called magical realism as applied to stories and novels. And it is the suspension of disbelief where magic is intertwined with realism in stories and novels and movies. And it is just accepted. And we see this very, very often in movies and novels and short stories and television series. But to our ancestors, it wasn't magical realism because to them, magic was real. Now, one of the differences between, or what I perceive as differences between mythology and fairy tales, is that in mythology, the magical attributes are attributed to a deity. When a miracle happens, when something out of the ordinary happens, it is a god or a goddess who causes that. And so Zeus turns himself into a bull, and that is a magical thing, but it was realistic to our ancestors. Jesus turns water into wine. That's even accepted in modern times as a miracle. A real reality is what I was trying to say. It's a miracle, but a reality. And so myth, when fantastic things happen in myth, it is due to a deity. In fairy tales, there is most often no reasoning given for why magical things happen. Now, we might read a fairy tale or hear a fairy tale about a witch, and the magic stems from the witch, but where does she get her power? In the Renaissance era and somewhat in the medieval era, the witch persecutions actually took place during the Renaissance, the Age of Enlightenment, and not in the medieval era as many people think. But during those times, the power of a witch might have come from Satan. But in pagan cultures, it didn't come from Satan. And a witch or a sorceress, a wizard, could be good as well as evil. And so that concept changed over time. But in other fairy tales, there are magical things that happen, and it isn't a witch who do it. We might have a wizard, but where does a wizard get his powers? It's never really truly explained, or has not been explained in fairy tales that I have read. Now, a fairy tale, well, first of all, let me say something about a myth. Robert Graves says that a true myth has no author. Now, he also says that the myth of Pandora was composed by Hesiod because it's the first place where it's recorded. And I had to disagree with Robert Graves because just because Hesiod was the first one to write it down does not mean that it didn't exist before that time. Now, we call all sorts of types of stories myth that do have authors. Now, why I'm bringing this up is that fairy tales, true fairy tales, have no authors. But this has changed throughout the ages, and when we read the fairy tales of Hans Christian Andersen's, we call them fairy tales, even though they have a specific author. But other fairy tales, Cinderella, Little Red Riding Hood, all of those tales, they have no authors. Now, having said that, the Brothers Grimm in Germany recorded the fairy tales, but they did not write them. They changed some aspects. For example, they quite often changed the evil mother to an evil stepmother, but they didn't write those tales. In France, we have Charles Perrault, who did the same type of thing. He recorded them, but he did not write them. The origins of those fairy tales, like myth, are lost in the far reaches of time. And whatever kernel of truth might be in them, it's really hard to dissect and find. There is one, though, that I find quite interesting, and it is the tale of Snow White. It's been quite some time. I started seeing in recent years, but it's been a couple of decades now. There was a theory that this actually could have been based on a reality. Not the reality that Snow White ate a poison apple, went into a coma, and came back to life, though that could have happened. But perhaps that the dwarves being outcast, real small people being outcast from a village, might have banded together for protection and mutual company. So maybe even within the fairy tales, as there are in myth, kernels of truth, but they're lost to time. Now, having said that, I want to point out some instances of where fairy tales are clearly adaptations of ancient myth. Now, did the people who adapted these fairy tales, and they probably occurred over a period of time, did they know that they were adapting them from ancient myths? Probably not, but the archetypes remain. And the first one I want to talk about is the tale of Little Red Riding Hood. Now, I'm going to post in the discussion for the week some really ancient tales of Little Red Riding Hood and Cinderella. But Little Red Riding Hood is very closely associated with the myth of Persephone. And I first became aware of this when I read a book called Women Who Run with the Wolves by Clarissa Pinkola Estes, in which she discusses the connections of Persephone and Little Red Riding Hood. So I didn't make this up. But in the book, she discusses how Persephone and Little Red Riding Hood are both drawn away from the path by flowers. Persephone is in the field with the daughters of Oceanus, and she leaves the security of the group because she sees a narcissus, which is a daffodil-like flower, and it draws her away, and it has been planted there on purpose, and this allows Hades to swoop down and get her. In Little Red Riding Hood, in the most popular versions, and there are variant versions, Little Red Riding Hood is tempted away from the path because she's picking flowers. Now, Hades abducts Little Red Riding, he doesn't abduct Little Red Riding Hood, he abducts Persephone, and Persephone is very young. And this is a story about the dangers of men kidnapping young girls. And this is also what the story of Little Red Riding Hood is about. The wolf is symbolic of an older man who tempts Little Red Riding Hood and then tries to abduct her and follows her, maybe he's even a stalker, back to Grandma's house. Now, we even use the word wolf, to denote a man who tempts women and takes advantage of women in the modern world. Now, Pinkola Estes also goes on to say that when Little Red Riding Hood is swallowed, when the wolf swallows her, and she isn't always swallowed in the earlier myths, that it is a descent into the underworld as the descent that Persephone makes into the underworld when Hades abducts her. I don't know about that, but I do buy into the flower aspect, and there is also another important aspect. Little Red Riding Hood is wearing red for a reason, and it symbolizes the onset of menstruation and being a young girl passing into the fertile period of her life. Persephone is in that same state. And what does Persephone eat in the underworld? She eats the pomegranate seeds. And what color are the pomegranate seeds? Why, they are red. So their color red is a very important aspect of these two tales, and they both symbolize blood, but not death blood, but the blood of menstruation. Now, there is another fairy tale that I see is very closely related. I won't say very closely related in how it plays out, but the opening scene is straight from a Greek myth, and that is the fairy tale of Sleeping Beauty. If you recall, Sleeping Beauty was born to her parents who had been waiting for a child, and they have a big party, a christening for her, and everybody in the kingdom is invited, including all of the fairies. But there is one fairy who is not invited, and of course it is the evil fairy. And what does she do? She crashes the party. She comes anyway, and she brings a present. And she gives a prophecy about this baby, saying that when she is of a certain age, and by the way, it's adolescence. Adolescence plays a big part in many of these fairy tales about women, that she will prick her finger on a spindle, and that is the spindle that when you spin yarn, the yarn collects on the spindle. How do you like that visual there? Collects on the spindle. She will fall into a sleep, and probably that means death. But then the other fairies soften it and says that she will sleep until the prince comes and kisses her. And by the way, the original stories of Sleeping Beauty, we'll talk about those in the discussion as well. That prince was not so charming. So we'll talk about that later. So how does this have its correlation in Greek myth? At the wedding of Thetis, and I think it's Peleus, and I should have looked it up and I didn't. When they are getting married, they invite everybody except for all the deities, except for Eris, the goddess of discord, who is the sister of Ares. And Eris, being the goddess of discord, likes to stir things up. And that's the reason why they didn't invite her. But guess what she does? She crashes that party, the wedding, anyway. And she brings a golden apple. And she throws it down on the floor in front of Hera, Aphrodite, and Athena. And on the apple it is inscribed, "To the fairest." And I don't remember if Eris explains this or not, but the apple is to go to the fairest goddess. And so these three goddesses start arguing over who should get this golden apple. And you'd think that Athena would not be interested in this. She's the goddess of wisdom, but man, she still wants to be the prettiest. And so they finally decide to find a judge, and that judge is Paris. Now, that ends the correlation with the fairy tale, but of course Paris was the son of Priam, king of Troy, and Priam had sent him away when he was a child because it was prophesied that he would bring the downfall of Troy. Well, Aphrodite tells Paris, hey, you vote for me, you decide on me, and I will give you the most beautiful woman in the world as your bride. And the most beautiful woman in the world was Helen, who is married to Menelaus. And that is how the Trojan War started. Now, if we were to examine other fairy tales, I'm sure that we would find other allusions and evolution from myths. I can think of one other. In Norse myth, Siegfried is a hero, and he awakens Brunhilde, who is sleeping, which of course goes back to Sleeping Beauty. And I'm sure that there are many other allusions that I have not drawn, and maybe you will be able to make some of those correlations from fairy tales that you have read and now that you are more familiar with myth. So, are myth and fairy tales the same genre? Well, they are fantastic stories. They have quite a few similarities, and they have some differences. Now, legends are different, and folktale are different. I'm not going to so much go into folktales, but legends are almost by definition based on a real person. Now, perhaps the origins of that person are lost in time, but Daniel Boone, who was a real person, has become a legend, and there are things that are told about him that are fantastical. John Chapman, many of you probably don't know that name, and I think these days people are probably less familiar with the name Johnny Appleseed, but John Chapman was Johnny Appleseed, and he was a real person. But there are legends, stories that have grown up about him that are fantastical. And I'm already at 16 minutes, so I am going to stop. This week, keep in mind that there are changes to the discussion and when assignments are due. And folks, we are down to the end. And if you look at the title on this, it says, "This is the end, my only friend, the end." And of course, that is a song by The Doors. And I can't think of the name. It might be just the end, but it begins, "This is the end, my only friend, the end," which just points to our mortality. And sooner or later, the ancients knew it and we knew it. The end comes. I'm going to stop babbling, and I'll see you in the discussion.